Hello and welcome to our scene on the Cold War. The Cold War was an era of conflict between the US and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers emerging from World War II. The Cold War lasted from 1945 to 1991. Although the two countries never directly attacked one another, many puppet wars, a space race, a blockade of Berlin, and near-nuclear war over Cuba were just some of the many issues that took place during these tense decades. Fitting with the theme of the Cold War, our scene anchor this time is an open refrigerator. Brrr, why is it so cold around here? Let's check it out. First, take a close look at our Cold War fridge. See how the fridge contains food and how the food inside is also contained in various containers? These containers should help you remember the word containment, which is the single most important word you should know about the Cold War. To understand why containment is so important, let's take a step back. The Cold War was a battle of philosophies. The US is a democracy with a capitalist economic system, while the Soviet Union was run by dictators on a foundation of communism and socialism. The US goal in the Cold War was to stop the spread of communism, a goal called containment. Now that we understand the containment, let's take a look at what's inside our fridge. First, take a look at this greasy turkey, fresh from Truman's Turkeys. This greasy turkey should help you remember that the US gave aid to Turkey and Greece through the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine provided economic and military aid to any country threatened by communism. This primarily helped Greece and Turkey. Come on down and try Truman's world-famous greasy turkey, available at any Truman's near you. Next, take a look at the container of green marshmallows. The word marshmallow should help you remember the Marshall Plan. Since dollar bills are green, these green marshmallows in front of a map of Europe should help you remember that the Marshall Plan gave European countries money in order to prevent the spread of communism. Next, take a look at this potato. Is that a star on the potato? That's right, this star is actually the symbol of NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This NATO potato should help you remember that NATO was a military alliance started by the US and Western Europe. NATO worked because every country in the alliance would fight together if the Soviets chose to attack any single one of them. The Soviet Union responded by creating their own alliance, called the Warsaw Pact. Next, check out this boy dropping condiments onto this burger. The dropping of condiments onto this Berlin burger should help you remember the Berlin airlift, when Truman used planes to drop supplies for US troops stationed in West Berlin. To understand why planes were necessary, you should know that Berlin was split into a west and east side after World War II. The west side of Berlin was occupied by the US, while the east was controlled by the Soviets. However, the entire city of Berlin is actually surrounded by East Germany, the half of Germany that was under Soviet control. How inconvenient. Since growing tensions made driving supplies into the city impossible, the only way to supply the US troops in Berlin was to use airdrops. That's why this boy is dropping supplies on top of the Berlin burger. Looking down, check out this burger and donut in between the refrigerator and freezer door. Because donuts are also called Berliners, we've drawn these here to help you remember JFK's famous 1963 speech in Berlin, or Berlin. In his speech titled Ich bin ein Berliner, or I am a Berliner, JFK declared that he was a Berliner in the sense that Berlin served as a model for all free people in the world, and that Berlin should never fall to communism. Moving up our Cold War fridge, take a look at the apple cores here. Just as the bottom shelf was all about Europe, these cores should help you remember that Korea was a major battlefront in the Cold War. First, take a look at these Korean cores with red tops. The red top should help you remember that North Korea, or the top of Korea, was communist and supported by the Soviets, while the South was supported by the US. Next, take a look at these onions dressed up as soldiers. The onion should help you remember that the United Nations, or the UN sent troops to fight Soviet influence in Korea. UN soldiers, you must mean the onion soldiers. Next, take a look at these split apple cores on a dirty plate. The dirty plate should help you remember the number 38. Get it? Dirty plate for 38? I was proud of that one. The split Korean cores should help you remember that Korea was split into North and South Korea along the 38th parallel. Let's move up to the next shelf. Take a look at this McFast Food Flaming Hot food wrapper. The McFast Food should help you remember the name Douglas MacArthur. The fiery hot food wrapper should help you remember that General MacArthur was fired by President Truman after he publicly spoke out against the president's policies. That's some fiery MacArthur. So hot, so spicy. Next, check out this piece of sweet caramel. This sweet caramel should remind you of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is a waterway in Egypt that was owned by Britain and France. When the Egyptian president seized the canal for Egypt, many feared he was acting under Soviet orders. But wait, are those eyes on the caramel? And why does this caramel look like a doctor? The eyes and the doctor should help you remember the Eisenhower Doctrine, which President Eisenhower issued in response to the Suez Canal crisis. The Eisenhower Doctrine said that any Middle Eastern country could ask for American economic or military aid if it was being threatened by armed aggression. The goal was always the same: to contain the spread of communism. Let's move up to the next shelf. See all the containers in the shelf are cubes? The cubes here should help you remember that Cuba was a major battlefront in the Cold War. First, take a look at this dead pig wearing a cast. This pig should remind you of the Bay of Pigs invasion, where American-trained rebels tried to overthrow the new communist government in Cuba. This pig is dead because the Bay of Pigs invasion failed miserably. The pig is wearing a cast to help you remember that the leader of communist Cuba was named Fidel Castro. The Bay of Pigs invasion led to Castro asking for more Soviet help. Moving right, take a look at this chef on a cruise boat facing some missiles. The missiles should remind you of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In response to Castro's need for help, the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, threatening the United States. The leaders of the US and the Soviet Union who talk to avoid nuclear war are commonly tested on exams. You should know that the US was led by President Kennedy, while the leader of the Soviet Union was Premier Khrushchev. To help you remember the name Khrushchev, just remember this cruise chef looking at the missiles. Next, take a look at the pizza with spreading red sauce. The pizza should remind you of the word domino in domino theory. The domino theory asserts that if one country in an area fell to communism, others would also turn communist, like dominoes falling one after another. The spreading red sauce below the pizza should help you remember that the domino theory described the spreading of communism. Next, take a look at these vitamin bottles. Who keeps vitamin bottles in their fridge, by the way? Anyways, these vitamin bottles should help you remember Vietnam, which is another puppet battleground in the Cold War. First, see the bottle that reads vitamin DB2? DB2 should help you remember the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where Viet Minh rebels captured a French garrison after the US refused to intervene. The next bottle is for vitamin T, which should help you remember the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, the first time Congress authorized US military action in Vietnam. Moving right, there is another bottle of vitamin T inside a raft. The letter T should help you remember the Tet Offensive, and the raft should help you remember that the Tet Offensive increased the drafting of Americans to fight in the Vietnam War. Shifting gears, let's take a look at the ground below our fridge to learn about the US home front. First, check out this yak. This yak is the HUAC yak, which should help you remember the House Committee on Un-American Activities, or the HUAC. The HUAC investigated what it considered un-American propaganda. This HUAC yak is stepping on a hissing snake in some roses. The snake should remind you of the name Alger Hiss. Hiss was a State Department official who was convicted of being a communist spy. These roses are also here to help you remember the Rosenbergs. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were American communists who passed nuclear weapon secrets to the Soviets. The Rosenbergs were convicted and executed for treason, which is why these roses are broken and dying. Finally, pay attention to this red car with its recurring MC or McC symbol. This McC car should help you remember the name Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy was well known for leading a witch hunt against Americans who he claimed were communists, which is why this red car is knocking over toy witches. Shifting gears, let's take a look at the sky above the fridge. Many important events in the Cold War took place in the sky. First, take a look at the bomb cloud in the sky. Are those arms coming out of the bomb? And why do the arms look like the letter H? This bomb with arms that looks like the letter H should help you remember that the US and the Soviet Union both developed hydrogen bombs, or H-bombs. H-bombs were nuclear weapons even more powerful than the nuclear bombs used in World War II. The competition to build the most powerful weapons led to the start of an arms race, which is why we've drawn this bomb with arms. Does he even lift? Whatever. Next, take a look at this spot. This spot with legs is drawn like the Sputnik satellite, which was the first Earth satellite launched by the Soviets in 1957. Sputnik scared Americans because they believed that the Soviets would build technology to dominate the US from outer space. This led to the creation of NASA in the USA and the start of the space race between the US and the Soviet Union. Next, check out this plane. What's that airline again? U-2? And that singer looks oddly familiar. This U-2 plane should help remind you of the U-2 spy plane incident when an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union in 1960. This proved that the US was spying on the Soviets from the air and increased tensions between the two superpowers. Afterward, take a look at this moon. Why is there an American flag on this moon? Isn't that flag a little too big? Anyways, this US flag on the moon should remind you of the fact that America was the first country to put a person on the moon in the Apollo moon landing of 1969. Next, pay attention to the space battle on the right. These Star Wars-esque fighters are shooting ray guns at a missile. The ray guns should help you remember that President Reagan, or President Raygun, launched the Strategic Defensive Initiative, or SDI, in 1983. The SDI was a missile defense system that many Americans called Star Wars, which is exactly why we've drawn these spaceships to look like fighters from Star Wars. So how did the Cold War end? Take a look at this falling croissant, which is unplugging the Cold War fridge. This croissant should help you remember the French word détente. Détente means the thawing of tensions in the Cold War, just like how this détente croissant causes thawing by unplugging our Cold War fridge. Détente croissants. Next, check out this gourmet chef who has broken the glass door to this fridge. The gourmet chef should help you remember the name Mikhail Gorbachev. Gourmet chef or Gorbachev? Anyways, see that transparent hole in the broken glass? The broken glass should help you remember the word glasnost, which means transparency in Russian. Gorbachev was the last leader of the Soviet Union who implemented glasnost to end repression and enable greater political freedom for Soviet citizens. Finally, see the pastrami being taken out of the fridge by a gourmet chef, Gorbachev? This pastrami should help you remember the word perestroika, which means restructuring in Russian. Perestroika restructured the Soviet economy, introducing free market practices, just like how our chef is restructuring the pastrami into sandwiches. But these reforms didn't make everybody in the Soviet Union happy. Looking up, you'll find a calendar in the month of August above our friend Gorbachev. This should help you remember the August coup of 1991, which is a failed attempt by hardline communists to overthrow Gorbachev and take over the Soviet Union. Glasnost and perestroika effectively eliminated many of the political and philosophical differences between the United States and the Soviet Union, leading to the thawing of relations. The eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 signified the official end to the Cold War. And that's it for the Cold War. To summarize, the Cold War was an era of tense relations and puppet wars between the US and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers emerging from World War II. Picture the mini containers in this fridge to remember the US policy of containment. Think of the apple cores to remember the battles of Korea. Picture our dead pig in the Khrushchev to remember the events and people involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And recall our broken glass and pastrami to remind yourself of glasnost and perestroika, the major Soviet reforms ending the Cold War. Whew, and that was a long one. And what's in that freezer? Got any ice cream? I'll see you next time.